Thank you, Dan, and thanks everyone for coming to our sessions. So Dan talked about the near-term outlooks with you guys. I'll be focusing on what has happened, so it's more like what has happened right now and what kind of lessons we can learn from what has happened. So I'll be talking about how prices are formed and what's the relationship between price and value, and what can be considered as fair for an African crude, fair value for African crudes, and what are the investment decisions you can make based on the interrelation between price and crude flows that you project that will happen in the near term and in the medium term. First of all, if we look at the physical flow of hydrocarbons from the upstream to the downstream, when you produce the crude, you move the crude to refineries worldwide, and the refineries will make them into refined products. So that's the physical flow of hydrocarbons. But when you think about the price impact, the value impact, crude itself has no value unless it's used. I would say 99% of the crude goes into refineries in the world. Very few gets directly burned, like Saudi Arabia during summer. So the refined products fundamentals, which dictates refined products price, will be translated into the refining margin for the refineries, and based on the refining margins, refineries decide which crude they want to buy, and eventually that has assigned value to the crudes. So that's how crudes get their value. They are valuable to refineries. And without refineries, crudes are worth of nothing. And talking about value and price, this is something I want to differentiate very much. As a producer, as an upstream producer, crudes are valuable to you, but how valuable are crudes to your buyers? That's another story. So the value that you think of your crudes are subjective. They're perceived, and they're indirect. They're reflected through the downstream refining process. So only when crudes are processed, they start to have a value, and that's not the same as the price of crude. When crudes are transacted, meaning when you sell the crude, the action of the sale assigns a price to the crude, and that price is typically either several bucks or even $20, $30 different from the value of crude. And this is something that will be discussed in some of the slides later. And you can see prices are usually very direct, meaning it's just very transparently showing to you. You see ice Brent futures today at some price. You see gasoline price at some, it could be either at a fixed price basis, say $90 per barrel, or you could be transacting at an index basis, for example, Platts 92 run gasoline plus $2. So these kind of price, they are direct and they're absolute and they're transacted, they're not perceived. So when we think about the value of crude, most people think of it from a gross product worth point of view. So if you refine a barrel of crude into different products in a refinery, just the first stage of refining, just the crude distillation unit, nothing else, then you combine all the worth of these refined products. They combined give you the gross product worth, which is typically higher than the price of crude. And that's why refineries actually buy your crude to refine, because they want to make money. That margin is very important for them. Then for some of the crudes, which have, say, a competitive grade or a complementary grade to them. For example, if you're talking about the Malaysian Kimanis crude, you would say it competes against the US WTI Midland. So this kind of competition also a very, very important factor influencing the value of crude. When you have a big inflow of WTI Midland, say, into Europe, then similar quality crudes produced in Europe typically see a suppressed impact from such inflow. So that's the competition there for you. And to very accurately reflect that gross product worth, I think one of the most important thing to look at is the refined products cracks. When we talk about crack, it's the very simple mathematical spread between refined products and crude oil. So we're looking at two major markets for African crude. That's the Northwest Europe and Asian market. So you see the cracks in different markets usually tell very similar stories. You have a blowing out of the crudes, of the cracks due to the war, then sort of converging a bit. But then you see the different refined products have extremely different economics. And say if your crude is rich in some of the refined products that are doing well, then your crude is very sought after, and you should be able to ask for higher price of your crude. And that's precisely happened to crudes with very high diesel yield. Diesel, jet fuel, what we call middle distillates, and a lot of the WAF crudes, Western African crudes, they are rich in middle distillates. So in theory, the Western African crudes, because of the war, not because of the war, due to the blowing out of the cracks, some of the Western African crudes are getting highly valued because of the high middle distillates cracks globally. And then if you think about the crudes that yield a lot of, say, fuel oil, then you can imagine that they're not doing particularly well for such crudes. These are typically the heavier crudes. So if we compare the main West African crudes versus Middle Eastern crudes, you can see that in terms of the API, they're actually very similar. They're both considered median in terms of their API, but in terms of sulfur, they're very different. The West African crudes are extremely sweet, meaning very, very low in sulfur, while the Middle Eastern crudes are, generally speaking, sour crudes, and their sulfur content is usually above 1%, or some of them above 2%, while for WAF crudes, it's typically below 0.5. So to a refiner, you would imagine that they would pay a much bigger premium to buy the African crudes simply from the processing kind of cost, because it takes less effort to refine the African crudes, which is true because they don't need that much desulfurization. So the cost is lower to process West African crudes compared with Middle Eastern crudes. But you will see later that the refiners are not paying as much as you think they should. Now we're going to talk about the spread between value and price. We're using a very simple example of a simple refinery just cracking crude in Singapore. So the spread, if it's wide, then for a refiner it's good because they can recover a portion of that spread to make such money. So the wider, the better for refiners. And the wide refining margin also means the crude price is depressed, is discounted compared with its value. So two examples. One is Nigeria's Bonny Light. Another one is Oman. So these two crudes in 2022, we have a cracking yield of Bonny Light at 116. For Oman, the cracking yield is 102.82. So the difference between the value of the two is very wide at $13 per barrel. But in terms of a spot price, you could see Bonny Light was roughly $100 per barrel, while Oman was roughly 96. So Oman, in comparison with Bonny Light, you can say that Oman is being sold at a very good price for the seller, while Bonny Light is not being sold at a good price because the spread is so big compared with that spread for Oman. In fact, Bonny Light is not the only WAF crude that's facing this problem. We're comparing another two WAF crudes, that's Cabinda and Dahlia. You could see if you refine these 3 WAF crudes in Singapore, comparing with refining Oman in Singapore, you could see the enormous spread between the two, meaning that whoever that's selling Oman is really getting a good deal because of the very narrow spread, while whoever is selling WAF crudes in Singapore or in general in Asia, for whatever reason, they're not getting a very good deal for the seller. We'll discuss the reason in a bit. So let's change the topic a little bit to the evolution of markets. Decades ago, the crude supplies are typically point-to-point at a fixed price. But then you have the emergence of surplus supply or additional demand at some point in time. So you have the emergence of unmatched buyers, sellers. Eventually, that forced the emergence of spot market. And in terms of pricing the market, it's similarly, you have the reactions that the market participants have come up with. Originally, it's fixed price. Then you have a spot market. Then there's spot prices that come up. So say you have 100 barrels of crudes. Originally, 100 barrels of them transact at fixed price basis. Then now you have 101 barrel. That 1 barrel of crude becomes the new price indication. That's the marginal cost of your crude. And people start to index the rest of their crude against that spot price. So nowadays, even though the spot market is typically just 5 to 15% of the crude market, depending on which country, the spot price usually dictates 100% of all the crude price in the market. And with such huge price and exposure on the physical market, people start to hedge, and such paper market typically also settle against the spot price. That's why spot prices are so important, because they are the basis for 100% of the market. And now we talk about that benchmark thing. The indexation is to use a benchmark in your contract. And why do we use a benchmark? Very simply, commodities, unlike equities and futures, they are not homogeneous. Every single cargo has different quality, laycan, financial terms, etc. So what Platts benchmarks do is to establish almost like a common language for buyers and sellers to find a common understanding of the attributes. Then you apply your premium or discount onto this benchmark to price your individualized cargo. Say you have Bonny Light. Almost all the Bonny Light transact based on Platts dated Brent. Why do they do that? It's because the entire West African market transacts against Platts dated Brent. You don't want to be the odd one out, and you want to facilitate value comparison between all the other crudes. So they choose a benchmark. And I just talked about that one thing, the common practice in choosing benchmark. There are many factors that affect why people choose one benchmark or the other. From a quality perspective, you would realize that globally, most of the crudes that transact on dated Brent is because of the quality similarity. Then you have geographic proximity. This applies to most of the crudes that are priced against Dubai. Then you have how robust is this assessment, how much you trust this assessment. Some of you might know that the ICE Brent futures is a very, very big crude oil benchmark. And many people believe it's a very robust price. That's why a lot of markets also use ICE Brent futures in some cases. But again, it's a very financial, ICE Brent futures has a very big financial nature compared with dated Brent, which is a physical price. That's why a lot of the upstream, I wouldn't say upstream, but a lot of the physical players still choose dated Brent instead of ICE Brent futures. Effectiveness in usage, common practice, basically, say if an NPC chooses to use, say, WTI as the benchmark to export its crude, then NNPC is creating challenges for the buyer to value its crude because you're the only one in the whole WAF market using a different benchmark, which is not used in your destination market either. Your destination market, which is Europe and Asia, they also use Dated Brent. So that creates a problem. That's why you wouldn't see someone just randomly switch a benchmark. And lastly, ecosystem. Basically how easy it is to hedge your position, etc. So all these have a very profound impact on which benchmark to choose. And just briefly comparison, WTI, this whole complex, and the Dated Brent complex, they're both light, sweet crude. But the major difference is that the WTI complex is centered around a financial contract, the NYMEX light sweet futures. That's the WTI price you see on CNBC or you read in Financial Times. And when the US crudes are exported, they're exported at a physical differential on top of that WTI financial contract. So that's very different from dated, which itself is a physical benchmark, which itself is directly used as the benchmark for entire European and African crude oil market. But then you have the other one that's, again, very different from the other two. The Dubai benchmark, physical, but it's a median sour benchmark. So when the Middle East export its crude to Asia, actually anyone who exports similar quality to Asia typically price it against Dubai. So in terms of the composition of waterborne export, you could see that Dated Brent is roughly about 37% of global waterborne crude export. Then Dubai is about 20%. Everybody else combined was about 43% in 2021. So these are some of the, I would say, selected usage of Dated Brent globally. The dark blue countries issues official selling price against the Dated Brent, directly or indirectly. Then the light blue countries, they don't have a official selling price or official purchasing price. They just commercially transact all the non-Middle Eastern crudes based on Dated Brent. So it's the world's biggest commodity benchmark, bar none. Then you have the Dubai benchmark, which reflects median sour crudes loading out of the Middle East. But then you have competition from elsewhere, mainly the Russian crudes, some Mexican crudes. The Russian crudes loading out of the Far East and loading here, going to Asia, now are typically priced against Dubai. These two are new developments after the war, where euros are being actively avoided by the European market. So when it goes to India, the Russian euros are priced against Platts Dubai. Very easy to understand, first of all, in terms of quality, euros is very similar to Middle Eastern crudes. And in terms of the end market, majority of the Indian purchase is on Dubai basis anyway. So to make it easy for the Indian buyers, the Russian crudes loading even out of the West is pricing against Dubai. Similarly for SBOL, for all the other Far Eastern grades, Russian crudes, they price against Dubai because of the destination market's habit. So if you construct a contract, say a refiner buys crude, this is very typical. You have a Platts average, you have a differential, then your contract price. And that differential should include all the cost and adjustment between the benchmark to the delivery point or loading point. Now, if we apply this whole thing more upstream, say if the government is selling a block for exploration, or once the oil is found, now you start to produce crude. Can you still apply this whole structure? I think that will be a very good thing, because once you use the same benchmark as your downstream market, all the economics will be much easier to calculate. And for each segment, it's propagated So say if you're producing in an offshore block of Nigeria, and if your upstream is also linked to Dated Brent, so for every leg of your value chain, it's much more transparent and there's no need to change the pricing basis. Now I want to discuss why the previous topic on why there's a wide gap between the value of WAF crudes versus the price of WAF crudes. A lot of things affect the differentials against the benchmark. So if we think about how WAF crudes trade, they all trade against the Platts Dated Brent. So if the differentials are narrow, meaning, say, if you think about the crude's value, you think it should trade against Dated Brent plus $10, but in reality, it's only Dated Brent plus $5. Why such difference? The major reason behind, I believe, is in terms of the quantity and the logistics for the WAF crudes loading. Later, you'll see the WAF crudes loading fluctuates violently, and it's probably the worst in terms of the variation in its loading program globally. And buyers do not like uncertainty. And especially if you think the refineries take time to adjust and to run their linear program, and suddenly, if your loading this month is, say, for Bonny Light, the major buyer got 3 cargoes this month, the next month you get 0, then 2 months later they get 1 cargo. All such variation penalizes the value of your crude in the buyer's eye. And not only just the variation of that single grade, in fact, all the grades that's loading out of the WAF region varies quite a lot in terms of the loading program and for whatever domestic reasons, and that penalizes the value. Another thing is logistics. Say if a buyer is assigned a loading at the last 5 days of the month, typically you would see slippage, meaning the cargo gets delayed in loading and loads next month. The problem is, when you load the cargo next month from the most original seller, which is an MPC, the loading price becomes next month's OSP. And that OSP has a complete different economics for the buyer compared with the previous month OSP. And that's not something the buyers want. And all these kind of things penalizes the value of WAF crudes. And this is almost universal for all the crudes that loads out of the WAF region. So all these, they're actually something that's not really upstream, but it's how you sell your crude. It's the export part of your crude value chain that's penalizing the value of your crude that's produced here. But then, of course, there are other factors that are more universal, and I wouldn't say it's just unique to WAF. For example, timing. What kind of pricing period are you looking at versus what kind of loading period you're looking at? All these would mean a huge deal to the value of your crude, depending on the market structure. And of course, some premium if we're talking about a region that's having a war or financial terms. Are you offering 90-day LC, 180-day LC? All of that have a very profound impact on the value of your crude. So when we assess the value of WAF crudes, we assess those 24 WAF crudes there. Most of the more liquid Nigerian and Angolan ones. You can see our approach is to apply the spot differential on top of the forward dated Brent. To combine it, you can have a fixed price assessment, but then we also break down the differential to you. So what's the most important is that differential, that every day, if the differential changes, meaning the market's perceived value of your crude also changes. And the factors behind, I already elaborated some of them, like competition or refined products economics behind all these. Now I want to talk about the flow of crude. So on the left chart, you're seeing the mathematical difference between Brent and Dubai. You can see the wall pushed up Brent by much more than Dubai, which means the spread went very wide. But then you see this almost unprecedented kind of narrowing of the spread, meaning, relatively speaking, Brent became weaker while Dubai became relatively stronger. And these have very big impact on how crudes flow, because all the crudes that are priced against dated Brent would become more competitive in the buyer's eye with this spread narrow. And all the crudes that price against Dubai would become relatively more expensive in the buyer's eye as this spread narrow. And those are just physical crude spread. Say the first example is the red line, which is Louisiana light sweet versus Mars. So that's the US sweet sour spread or US light heavy spread. Then you have the North Sea spread, which is Ekofisk versus Johan Sverdrup. So you can see globally, all the crudes, generally speaking, have experienced this drastic decrease in terms of sweet-sour spread. And that drastic narrowing means that all the Atlantic Basin crudes, which typically price against dated Brent, become more competitive in the buyer's eye. And that does have an impact on the WAF crudes, because that should encourage the WAF crudes to find home in Asia more like easier compared with before, where the default market should be European market. And really, the global light-sweet balance is dictated by mainly two factors: how much the US is exporting versus how much OPEC Plus is exporting. Because the OPEC Plus happen to produce very similar grades, which is medium sour or heavy sour, while the US, the biggest grade from the US is WTI Midland, which is a light sweet crude. So the competition between these two major exporting forces would have a very big impact on the light sweet, on the sweet sour spread that we're seeing here. And this thing would have an indirect impact on all the other crudes that price against these two benchmarks. So that's something that I think the WAF producers should think about, especially how would that sweet-sour spread evolve in the next several years. Will the world produce more light sweet crude? Will the world see continued reduction or continued voluntary cuts from OPEC, which alters that sweet-sour spread, which would then change the economics of the WAF crude's destination? And as I mentioned, the East-West economics is really one major factor in terms of how, where WAF crudes go. Then if we look at itself, say Nigeria, if you have this kind of fluctuation in your loading, which is another, basically the second factor that I think affects the economics of WAF crudes export, that's the logistics, the variation of loading program that heavily penalizes African crude's price. Lastly, I want to use the same graph that Dan used previously. It's the closure of refineries and the startup of refineries. You can see in general, you have more startup in the developing world, especially centered around Middle East and Asia. Then in general, you have more closure in the developed world, especially US and Europe. So for WAF crudes, if you think where WAF crudes would flow in the future, I would say naturally you think Asia should take more but that might not necessarily be the case. Let's first look at the opportunities. As I mentioned, WAF crudes are very easy to process because of the ultra-low sulfur content. So actually, the simpler refineries, such as those in Europe, the remaining ones in Europe, as well as the ones in Africa, should favor this kind of easy-to-process crude. Then you have the continued Urals flow. The Russian crude continues to flow into Asia in the maximum amount, which leaves Europe room for taking WAF crudes. So Europe, as long as the trade flow doesn't normalize, meaning as long as Russia continues to export maximum to Asia, there's always room in Europe to take your WAF crudes. Then the higher distillate yield of WAF crudes is something that's really, at this moment, a good thing, because it has a higher middle distillate yield compared with the US WTI Midland. And if you look at the gasoline crack right now, compared with the diesel crack, it's a two kind of story. So at this moment, if you think about, and also in the near future, both Europe and Africa will continue to be very big short in terms of diesel. So that would be a really good thing for your diesel-rich WAF crudes. Then the challenges. The Asian refineries and the Middle Eastern refineries that are starting up, that have started up in the past 10 years, and those that will start are all complex refineries who are designed to produce inferior crudes. When these refineries were designed, I don't think the designers had in mind that the world would have so much light sweet crude that's coming up. And if you look at all the ones that are built in China, they're designed to process Venezuelan crude, Iranian crude, some Mexican crude, all of which are considered either heavy sour or medium sour. So WAF crudes, compared with such crudes, don't have a natural advantage because the refineries were designed to process inferior crudes anyway. Then your European transportation fuel demand, which my colleague Dan will talk about in a bit, is peaking or have peaked. So how much are the refiners willing to pay a premium to buy your transportation fuel-rich WAF crude? That's another question. So this is my presentation. I noticed my time is up. If anyone has a very quick question, I can take it. If not, I'll hand it back to Dan. No? Thank you.